Okay, everyone, we start in 5 minutes.
Great, thanks, Brian. Hello, is this okay?
All right, we start in 1 minute. Joan, please turn on your video and your microphone.
Good luck, Joanne.
Thank you.
All right, we go live in 3, 2, 1. We are live.
Welcome all. Thank you for joining us today as we enter into the second day of the Regional Conference on Decriminalisation of Petty Offences in Africa. I would like to commence this session by first providing a brief highlight of yesterday's deliberations, which were commenced by an opening session graced by Honorable Commissioner Manuela, who emphasized on the importance of states to undertake the requisite reforms to decriminalize petty offences in Africa. This was further emphasized by Tem from Open Society Foundation and Abdul Nur Mohammed, particularly in the wake of policing and enforcement of COVID-19 regulations and laws, which have been characterized by arbitrary arrests and discriminate attacks on key populations and minority groups. We had presentations from representative civil society organizations drawn from the eastern, southern, northern, and western regions of Africa. Our panelists gave elaborate presentations on law and regulations and their adverse effects on the poor and marginalized populations, with a focus on street vendors, the homeless, amongst other people. They also gave discussions on the socioeconomic impact of state responses to COVID-19, an analysis of the COVID-19 laws adopted by Tunisia to combat and prevent the spread of COVID-19 and its impact on human rights was also discussed. Finally, we had a representative who discussed the attempts by Nigeria to adopt alternate measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 in Nigeria. We were also privileged to receive your feedback, which indicated that 97% of us were not satisfied with the measures that are being undertaken by the states and did not consider and were of the opinion that the measures that were being taken did not consider the needs or factor in the needs of the key populations and minority groups. Additionally, only a paltry 3% expressed satisfaction with the manner with which their states handled or responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is notable from our discussions that the legislative responses by the state to COVID-19 have had adverse impact on key populations and minority groups. Throughout the conference session, it was generally affirmed that legislative and statutory frameworks recognize that in the context of serious public health threats and public emergencies that threaten the life of a nation, restrictions on some rights can be justified. However, the said restrictions must have a legal basis. They must be strictly necessary and based on scientific evidence. They should not be arbitrary or discriminatory in their application. They should be of limited duration, respectful of human dignity, subject to review, and proportionate to achieve the intended objective. I will now hand over to Louise Edwards to proceed with the program for the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanne, and thank you again to the International Commission of Jurists Kenya chapter for hosting us with their Zoom facility. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Louise Edwards, the Director of Research and Programs at the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. So following yesterday's discussion on the impact of criminalisation, today we want to move the conversation to the issue of the impact of the enforcement of COVID-19 regulations by the police on the poor and the marginalised. But before we begin, there's many people who are joining us who are actually new to the campaign. And we want to begin today by playing a short video that we developed a few years ago that summarises the challenge generally before we begin to delve into the COVID-19 specific challenges. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to play that video for you.
Most laws are there to keep us all safe and to bring justice to victims of crime. There are some laws in Africa dating back to colonial times still being used to unfairly target marginalized people. and creates a spiral of consequences with enormous socio-economic drawbacks. This is John. He is 32 and has never been arrested until now. He has 2 children and a wife whom he supports by selling vegetables in the center of town. One day, John sets up his onion and tomato stand in a new location, where he hopes to make a bit more money as his daughter, Akeo, is going to begin her diploma. So he moves his stand closer to the town hall, hoping for customers with a bit more money, as it is also near the taxi rank. One day, the president of the country is due to make a speech at the town hall. The police are clearing the streets of undesirables such as beggars, street children, street traders, and suspected sex workers. Relying on arcane bylaws, many traders and others deemed not to belong near the town hall are arrested. John has now been in prison for 2 months awaiting trial. Since in detention, his wife has had to borrow money from friends and family to pay for food and transport to the prison. Detainees receive only 1 meal a day and rely on food from their families. Akeo did not begin school as planned. She missed the registration date as there was no money to pay the fees. John's brother has taken his family in as they lost the room they were renting. The ripple effect of consequences of one arrest for a petty offense is often devastating, long-term, and even permanent. Poverty is not a crime, yet John was arrested because he was supporting his family and giving his daughter an education. What laws in your country are used to target poor and marginalized people? Let's work together to decriminalize petty offenses. Contact us for the tools and research that can help you to lobby your government for change.
So we made that video a few years ago, so we do need to update the logos at the end, but it will be available, if not already, on the campaign's YouTube channel. So I want to now hand to Abdurrahman Malim Gossaf, who's a colleague of mine at APCOF. He's going to provide us with some context for our discussion today on this specific issue of COVID-19 regulation enforcement, policing, and its impact on the poor and the marginalised. So please go ahead, Gossaf.
Thank you very much, Louise. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. As has been highlighted by my colleague, my name is Abdurrahman Maalim Gusar, and I'm a project and research officer at APCOF. I'm going to introduce today's session for discussion. Under the broader theme of policing pandemics, today's sub-theme looks at the enforcement of COVID-19 measures by law enforcement agents and the impact this has had on the poor and marginalized. Now, more than 6 months have passed since the World Health Organization classified COVID-19 as a pandemic, and states across the world began to deploy measures intended to limit and prevent the spread of the virus. In many cases, we have seen states ground their responses on human rights-centered measures that are largely guided by the best available.
Gossar, can I just stop you for a second? I'm sorry, we're getting the Portuguese translation through the English channel. Okay, Gossar, can you just go back just about a minute and you can pick it up again now. They've fixed the problem. Please continue.
Okay, thank you, Louise. 6 months ago, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Since then, we have seen states across the world began to deploy measures intended to limit and prevent the spread of the virus. In many cases, we have seen states ground their responses on human rights-centered measures that are guided by the best available scientific evidence. On the African continent, generally, many responses have been tailored in favor of blanket limitation and suspension of constitutional rights and guarantees, with widespread use of criminal law to penalize infringement of COVID-19 rules and regulations. Freedom of movement in particular has been severely restricted, with most countries deploying heavily armed police officers, military personnel, and other non-state actors such as commercial security companies to implement lockdowns and curfews. Those deemed to be in violation of COVID-19 rules have in many instances faced violent and aggressive responses from state authorities, We have seen media reports and video footages of police organizations in many parts of the continent employing violent and repressive policing tactics and techniques to enforce lockdowns and curfews, in some cases resulting in the death of citizens. Most of those affected by the enforcement of these measures are the poor and marginalized, which includes the homeless, drug users, commercial sex workers, informal traders, immigrants, and women, amongst others. There are various ways in which states can adopt, there are various mechanisms, that states can adopt to deal with public health crises. The medical community has impressively and consistently relied on scientifically tested and proven methods and practices to deal with the pandemic. So why have our governments deployed heavily armed police officers and military personnel to address measures that have been adopted to deal with public health crises? Should our experience with other public health challenges, such as Ebola, perhaps have pointed in a different direction? Why is policing culture and approach in most of our African countries shaped by military and doctrines and tactics? Some scholars of crime and policing have argued that this is partly due to a deep-seated self-belief, a deep-seated belief in the use of punitive criminal justice methods to address disorder, in terms of which there is an acceptance, largely on the part of policymakers, that crime and non-compliance with laws are more effectively controlled by harsh and aggressive measures. This, they have argued, has been combined with militarization of social control, particularly law enforcement. It is indeed questionable whether punitive methods and militarized law enforcement have been tested and found to be effective in the reduction and prevention of even violent crime. If anything, there are convincing arguments to the effect that policing culture that prioritizes the use of violence to enforce laws vitiates public confidence and trust in the police. Police organizations and agencies need public cooperation and trust to effectively fight crime and enforce laws. There is no doubt that targeted state interventions are required to deal with COVID-19, which may inevitably involve limitation of human rights. International human rights law provides for this. Not all human rights are absolute. Some human rights are susceptible to limitation, provided any restriction imposed by states are justifiable under international human rights standards and can withstand strict scrutiny. State efforts and interventions therefore need to strike a balance between the promotion and protection of public health and safety on the one hand, and respect and fulfillment of in non-derogable constitutional rights and dignity of all. Without further ado, may I then hand back the mantle to Louise Edwards, the moderator, to proceed with the session. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks very much, Gossa. So that was some great scene setting. And as Gossa has foreshadowed, we're going to spend the next couple of hours really exploring this issue of the impact of the enforcement of COVID-19 regulations by law enforcement officials on marginalised and disadvantaged groups. And we really want to unpack three issues: what the impact is, why it's happening, and how we can address it from our own various vantage points. So we've split the session into two parts, and it's described in the program as a conversation with experts on the impact of police enforcement of COVID-19 regulations. But I mean, that's a bit of a misnomer, because I think most of us who are participating in this conference, as audience members, as panelists, are coming at it in terms of our own experience with our own expertise. So in this sense, what we want to do is to engage not only our panel, but you in further comments, questions, follow-up. And we want to give you this opportunity for input in the second hour today. Additionally, in the lead up to this conference, we asked campaign members to make short videos to describe the impact of COVID-19 regulation enforcement in their own country. So we received 8 of those, and we'll be playing them sort of throughout the session this morning. So for everybody attending the conference, we do have an eminent panel that I'll introduce just now who are going to speak to us for the first hour. But please feel free to address your questions and your comments, not only to our panelists, but to those who provided the videos. And those clips will all be available, if they're not already, on the campaign's YouTube channel. So I want to introduce our panel of experts today. So we're very grateful once again to have the Honourable Commissioner Maria Teresa Manuela, Special Rapporteur on Prisons, Conditions of Detention and Policing in Africa, and Commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We're also joined by Annika Miakota, the Legal Director from the Southern African Litigation Centre. We're also joined by Adrian Tossa Moncho, the National Coordinator of Le Même Droit pour Toi, MDT in Guinea, and I apologise for my French. I've got my colleague, Temba Masuku, who's a Program Manager at APCOF, and finally Lydia Kembabazi, the Legal Manager at Advocate in Sierra Leone. And we're going to be hearing videos from campaign members bringing further perspectives from Sierra Leone, Uganda, the Central African Republic, Malawi, Morocco, as well as a regional perspective in terms of the rights of people who use drugs. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions of our experts, and then I'm going to open it up to you who have joined us today. But before we do that, I'd like to invite you now, please, using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, to let us know who's there, who you are. We don't have the benefit of an in-person conference. We can't look at each other in the eye. We can't shake each other's hands. So please, using the Q&A, tell us who you are, where you work, and which country you're in. And as you're doing that, I want to begin by playing a video that's going to sort of set the scene for today's Q&A with our experts. So this video was submitted by our colleagues at Advocate in Sierra Leone. And in this clip, it describes the experience of their client, Ms. Barr, who was arrested by the police under COVID-19 regulations. So I'm going to share that clip for us just now. But in the meantime, please tell us who you are, where you're from in the chat box.
I don't go to me na Central Police Station. They say me for pay 100,000, but I send them all the money na me arm. I be only become picking them. I be left them na house. I not be for the kids. I be go na go sports go buy for them. But I be manage. So we did it say past 3 hours. One lady night kind say where the work na advocate. So nine can beg for me. Nine can beg for me. Whatever left me for that money there, without no pay. If they for you say that's what your man and you go and say now by force. If you no pay, you never come yonder. So me now my man no be in action. I no be get money. So now that lady there, nine help me, nine beg for me. Be the woman there. Whatever left me without no pay that money. So be glad for her. Say we tell her thank you. So we dey beg Papa government, say anybody wey dey talk nonsense, you know get face mask. Yeah, we dey beg let them make the person buy the face mask by force before then arrest and then go to a police station to pay that money. They then put it under the worry because if na first time that day to go to police station, you know get person wey dey help you dey suffer, you dey worry back.
So Ms. Barr was really fortunate to have the services of Advocate, and being arrested and detained for not wearing a mask really draws immediate parallels with the work of the campaign and of the African Commission to end the unnecessary criminalisation, and really does echo the discussions we were having yesterday about the inappropriate use of criminal sanction. I want to bring Commissioner Manuela in here as our first expert. Bom dia, Commissioner. She's as we said, the Special Rapporteur on prisons, conditions of detention and policing in Africa. Thank you very much for being part of this discussion, Commissioner. I want to start by observing that during the ordinary session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which was just recently held, there was a very strong focus on the human rights impact of COVID-19. In your view, as the Special Rapporteur on prisons, conditions of detention and policing in Africa, what are the most critical human rights challenges when it comes to policing and COVID-19 restrictions? So I'd invite you, Commissioner, if you'd like to answer that question.
Boa tarde, Luís. Obrigada. Boa tarde a todos os colegas do painel e boa tarde a todos os participantes. Não sei se estou a ser ouvida.
We can, Commissioner. Thank you.
Muito obrigada. Efetivamente, Luís, a última sessão da Comissão Africana teve como pano de fundo o impacto da Covid sobre os direitos humanos e dos povos. Como sabemos, e como disse Luís e bem, há algumas pessoas novas que se juntaram a este grupo. Devo dizer que a Comissão trabalha com base em mecanismos especiais, isto nos termos do artigo 25 do seu regulamento interno, o regulamento 2020. E cada um destes órgãos tem uma área específica para tratar. E, durante a sessão, cada um dos relatores especiais cuidou de identificar o impacto da Covid sobre a sua área de trabalho. Como pode ver, eu fiquei, o meu mecanismo tive que olhar para duas frentes. A primeira frente, portanto, sobre o impacto da pandemia nas prisões, e a segunda frente sobre o impacto da pandemia sobre as populações vulneráveis e a atuação das forças da ordem e segurança, que tiveram que ser acionadas para impor isto. E isto, portanto, leva-me à segunda linha do meu mandato, que é a ação policial. Luís, devo dizer que devemos ter sempre em linha de conta um binômio que foi tido pelos Estados, que é evitar a propagação da pandemia com as suas consequências, e isto ocasionou a restrição de direitos e liberdades fundamentais. Neste particular, devo dizer que na comissão nós apreciamos bastante algumas questões que foram levantadas, mais concretamente no que diz respeito ao... Estou a tentar cronometrar o tempo, Luís, desculpe, que é para permitir gerir bem o meu tempo. Portanto, houve respostas rápidas por parte dos governos para impedir que a pandemia se alastrasse e criasse problemas muito graves. Como consequência, foram declarados vários estados de emergência em quase todos os países de África. E nesse estado de emergência foram suspensos vários direitos. Um deles, o da livre circulação, que foi aquele que mais atingiu as faixas da população mais desfavorecidas. Por quê? Porque estas faixas populacionais dependem do exercício da atividade diária para a sua subsistência. E, por causa disso, estas pessoas, estou a falar de vendedores ambulantes, mendigos, crianças de rua, pessoas sem teto mesmo, profissionais de sexo, entre outras faixas populacionais que os próprios princípios descrevem, tiveram um impacto muito negativo. As normas que foram aprovadas impôs à polícia que coercivamente impusesse a ordem e as regras que foram aprovadas para a contenção da pandemia. Lembremos-nos, isso também foi referenciado durante a nossa sessão, que a própria polícia foi apanhada de surpresa e não foi feita qualquer preparação em relação às medidas de exceção que eles haviam de impor, na maior parte dos países, porque nós conhecemos bem como funciona a nossa polícia em África. Por causa disso, portanto, na sua atuação, a polícia entrou em colisão com uma máxima geral, que é o equilíbrio que deve existir entre o cumprimento da lei e o respeito pelos direitos, liberdades e, inclusive, principalmente, a dignidade da pessoa humana. A maior parte das normas a nível dos países teve como slogan principal: fique em casa. Fique em casa. E é este slogan, é esta ordem, é este imperativo que levou a que houvesse graves violações relatadas na maior parte dos países. A maior parte das delegações que participaram da 66ª sessão,
Sorry,
principalmente...
interrupt just for a moment, Commissioner Manuela, I'm very sorry. We're being told that there's a problem with the French translation. If you could just wait 1 second, we're going to see if we can
Muito bem,
resolve that problem.
aguardo.
I'm very sorry, Commissioner. I'm just waiting for the go-ahead. They're working on it. Just 1 minute.
Tá bem, eu falo devagar.
If I can get a go-ahead. Okay, great. Please continue, Commissioner. I'm very sorry. The translation issue is sorted.
Luiz, começo por onde? Onde é que deixaram de me ouvir?
You may continue from where you were, Commissioner.
Pois, eu dizia que na maior parte dos países foi imposto o recolhimento obrigatório. Esse recolhimento teve como lema: fique em casa. Então, foi esta norma imperativa que foi adotada pela maioria dos Estados. E eu dizia que durante a 66ª sessão ordinária, a sociedade civil, as instituições nacionais de direitos humanos, tanto de falo sociedade civil, que são as instituições nacionais de direitos humanos, assim como as ONGs filiadas e membros da Comissão Africana, trouxeram-nos muitos relatos, para além daquilo que no dia a dia vamos vendo na imprensa em todo o mundo. Mas trouxeram-nos relatos bem firmes e documentados de como este slogan levou à violação de muitos direitos. Vamos começar por dizer que foi relatado o uso desproporcional da força para impor a norma. Houve o uso de armas letais que levaram a que muitas pessoas perdessem a vida. Isto resultou em homicídios, resultou em ferimentos graves, resultou em muitos distúrbios. Houve relatos de violência sexual. Houve detenções arbitrárias, pois todas as medidas previstas não impunham necessariamente uma prisão. Quando os governos adotaram este lema de ficar em casa, penso que a pena correspondente nunca deveria ser a prisão. Houve relatos de tratamento cruel, desumano e degradante, extorsão de valores, inclusive para aqueles que não os tinham. E houve relatos de vigilância intrusiva via online. Estes factos não só afetaram os mais desfavorecidos, mas também afetaram jornalistas e ativistas de direitos humanos, muitos deles no exercício das suas próprias funções. O problema que se colocou às faixas etárias mais desfavorecidas, de que nós já vimos falando até aqui, é que ficar em casa era um verdadeiro dilema. O primeiro dilema é que não tinham, às vezes, casa onde ficar. O segundo dilema é que as casas para onde deviam estar recolhidas não reuniam as condições que as normas para a não expansão da pandemia impunham. Não havia água, não havia eletricidade em muitas dessas casas. E as pessoas que não possuem meios financeiros para se manterem em casa por longos tempos. Por quê? Porque estas pessoas dependem da atividade diária para o sustento da sua família. Precisam de sair à rua para empregos ocasionais, e com isto, então, poderem alimentar as famílias. Isto em relação aos mais desfavorecidos. Vamos olhar para a faixa dos jornalistas e defensores. Esses, o seu mister impunha que monitorassem, que observassem, que conversassem com as pessoas para permitir que estas pessoas entendessem o momento que se vivia e que fazia com que o Estado lhes impusesse essa restrição de ficarem em casa, mas nem esses sequer foram poupados. Sobre isto, a Comissão Africana já emitiu vários comunicados. Nós estamos emitindo comunicados desde março. E nesses comunicados estamos a pedir aos governos para não fazerem opções tristes, como, por exemplo, necessidade. Não há necessidade de uso da força. Emergência nacional não impõe necessariamente o uso de força letal. Ordem pública não impõe necessariamente o uso de força letal. E estes 3, 4, 5 comandos não devem servir como justificativa para detenções arbitrárias ou mesmo detenções para tortura, para tratamento punido. Porque essas detenções que foram feitas em massa trouxeram um outro problema jusante, que é o aumento do número de encarcerados, superpopulação nas cadeias, que é outro problema com que já vimos tratando há bastante tempo, e sobre ele também produzimos um comunicado de imprensa, Luiz.
Thank you, Commissioner. I mean, these are grave challenges, but I'm looking for something hopeful here. Like, what lessons can we learn from the way you've observed the police enforcement of COVID-19 restrictions against people who you've said are the most poor and marginalised, those who are homeless, with houses without conditions that are conducive to staying at home? So in your view, what have the police done right? What have they done wrong? And what advice would you give to governments in this regard?
Luiz, a tua pergunta encerra duas. Vamos primeiro perceber o que é que falhou. O que é que falhou para que houvesse essa colisão. Porque temos que perceber, e ontem foi dito, várias vezes tem sido dito, que em princípio o governo é uma pessoa de bem, uma pessoa coletiva de bem. E não deve sacrificar a sua população para dar respostas. O que aconteceu, Luísa, é que houve o uso desproporcional da força, militar ou militarizada. E a questão a que foi dada a resposta não era uma questão de militar, era uma questão social, que carecia de respostas sociais. Então, os governos, os nossos governos africanos, e a maior parte reconhece que ainda não conseguiu reunir condições sociais para poder dar uma condição de vida condigna ao seu cidadão. Nós temos problemas sérios com os DESC, os direitos econômicos, sociais e culturais, temos muitos problemas, e é por causa disso, o governo, ao invés de pensar numa resposta social para as questões que a Covid-19 levantou, preferiu dar uma resposta de força. Não houve condições para a resposta social, por quê? Porque, como eu disse no princípio, continuam a dizer que não há tradução para francês.
Are we having another issue with translation into French? Brian, are we able to resolve that? Sorry, I'm very, very sorry, Commissioner. Just 1 minute. The translators, can you be in touch with the technicians behind the scenes, please? We can hear you in English, Commissioner. but the issue is the Portuguese to French interpretation.
Ok. Para francês, ok.
Is there someone
Muito
able
bem, tá
to
bem.
indicate to me if we're working on that?
Sim, senhora. Tá bem, eu aguardo.
Sorry, Commissioner, just a moment. I'm seeking to clarify if we're getting a resolution to the French translation challenge. Okay, we're sorting it out. So the technicians are on it.
Luiz, esse é o problema de trabalharmos virtualmente. Temos que todos perceber que são novas as condições em que trabalhamos e há constrangimentos até no momento.
This is it. Thank you very much for your understanding, Commissioner. Yeah. Just waiting on an update. Can we get an indication from anyone listening to the French translation? Are you able to hear? Okay, so now I'm hearing French, not English, eh? Oh, okay, okay, great. So can we continue?
Sim, senhora. Vamos continuar e vamos ser
Great.
um bocadinho mais breves porque o tempo já está a contar para terminar.
So please don't censor yourself, Commissioner. Please take the time that you're allocated.
Tá bem. Pois, então eu dizia que houve um uso desproporcional da força para uma resposta que devia ser social. Os governos não tiveram em conta que as pessoas, por vezes, não tinham casa onde ficar. Não tiveram em conta que, para sustentar a família, o período de recolhimento era nevrálgico para aquele que todos os dias precisa de encontrar alguma coisa para dar à família, para oferecer à família. Vimos naquele vídeo que apresentou Luísa que ao facto de terem arrestado, de terem detido várias pessoas para as prisões, muitas pessoas, muitas famílias ficaram desestruturadas. Olha para aquela menina que deixou de ir à escola. Então, também deveria, portanto, não houve um diálogo. Passado o primeiro susto que nós todos tivemos um susto de perceber que, efetivamente, os nossos dias estavam contados. E isto, o homem das forças de segurança, da ordem de segurança, também são pessoas e tiveram o mesmo susto. Mas, passado esse susto, deveria o governo proporcionar espaço para contactar as pessoas diretamente afetadas, a fim de encontrar as melhores formas de cumprir esse recolhimento. Que os agentes da autoridade que iriam para o terreno fossem informados e formados acerca das medidas de coação e que deviam ser também formados no sentido de usar medidas alternativas, privilegiando as menos coercivas, para aqueles que efetivamente desobedecessem ao recolhimento. Que conselho é que posso deixar para os Estados? Os nossos os documentos que nós temos partilhado no site da Comissão Africana, que são os comunicados de imprensa, declarações que fizemos ainda na 66ª sessão, deixam bem claro a posição da Comissão em relação a esses aspectos. É que há necessidade de continuarmos a dialogar com os governos para que a resposta às pandemias, e não só pandemia, porque esta é uma das pandemias, Nós assistimos pandemias da ébola, do Marburg, há mais pandemias e podem vir mais, porque o amanhã não é nosso, não está sob nosso domínio. Então, as respostas a esse tipo de pandemias devem ser sociais e não coercivas. Porque quando houver ameaça à segurança do território, ali sim, as respostas passam a ser securitárias. Ali, nós respeitamos a posição tomada por qualquer governo para que se mantenha, que mantenha a integridade do seu Estado. E ali deve sim criar condições para garantir que essa segurança se mantenha, porque é um pilar importantíssimo para a existência do próprio Estado. Sugerimos também aos Estados que esta crise, que não vai terminar agora, isso já está sendo dito a todos os níveis, inclusive o nosso centro diz isso, deixe-nos a oportunidade de ensaiar melhores modelos de saúde, educação, que a educação seja inclusiva, que haja um diálogo, inclusive, com os demais parceiros, sobre as prioridades nas populações. Há esta situação, qual deve ser a prioridade? Vamos ouvir as pessoas sobre as quais as medidas vão impactar diretamente. Também vamos dar prioridade, portanto, à proteção social das faixas mais desfavorecidas, mais vulneráveis. E que também os parceiros sociais sejam convidados, sejam chamados a participar das respostas aos problemas em situação de crise. O governo não pode querer resolver tudo sozinho sem ouvir os parceiros. Também pedimos aos governos que sejam revistas leis, principalmente aquelas que criminalizam pequenos delitos. Vimos a situação do segundo vídeo em que alguém foi levado para a esquadra porque não estava a usar a máscara. Eu devo trazer com muita tristeza um exemplo que ocorreu aqui no meu país, onde estou, Angola, em que um médico saído de um serviço de internamento de 3 dias, no carro, sozinho, foi arrestado porque não tinha a máscara. Então, estas leis devem ser revistas e quando se está em período de crise, as normas devem ser adequadas à situação para dar a resposta efetiva e proporcionais. Não podem agravar mais as situações que já existem. Disse no princípio, disse ontem e continuo a dizer que as detenções efetuadas ao abrigo das leis do Covid, principalmente de não usar máscara, não aglomerar, não vender na rua, ficar em casa, e outras detenções que são feitas, por vezes, por leis caducas da era colonial, que não foram revistas para serem adequadas à nova situação em África, tem um efeito colateral gravíssimo, que é o congestionamento das prisões, com as consequências que daí vêm. Um outro aspecto que nós podemos também apelar aos Estados é que as forças da ordem têm que ser capazes de contribuir para as respostas positivas. Elas devem ser informadas, formadas e obrigadas a cumprir os ditames necessários para o equilíbrio dos pilares para a restrição necessária. Deve ser respeitado o princípio da necessidade, da legalidade e da proporcionalidade em relação ao que quer que seja que um agente da ordem vai fazer. Também devem ser privilegiadas armas não letais e que os Estados, o governo, digo, deve privilegiar, fornecer, apetrechar as forças da ordem com esses meios não letais. Também devem ser os agentes da ordem responsabilizados pelos excessos que causarem e principalmente se desses excessos resultarem mortes, resultarem ferimentos ou resultarem qualquer outra ofensa à dignidade da pessoa humana, que é o pilar número 1. Por último, incentivar que os governos legalizem, incentivem a criação e legalizem mecanismos independentes para poder supervisionar o trabalho prestado pela polícia, porque o trabalho prestado pela polícia é muito importante. Apenas precisa de ser partilhado com a sociedade para que haja um equilíbrio entre a ordem e o respeito pelos direitos humanos. Quanto à resistência que foi sendo apelada por vários países para usar a força, há vários métodos de quebrar essa resistência. Por que não tentar, por exemplo, meios persuasivos, por meio de conversa, de diálogo? No meu país, novamente, trago um exemplo bom da polícia, que foi ir para a rua com microfones e persuadir, conversar com as vendedoras ambulantes, porque no meu país foram determinados dias para poderem vender e outros não. Esse aspecto foi agora ultrapassado com o último levantamento. Então, esses meios de persuasão também permitem às senhoras, a essas faixas populacionais, perceberem que estamos numa situação diferente da normal e devemos, em conjunto, proteger-nos uns aos outros para que a pandemia não crie mais problemas do que já existem. Entretanto, também já está sendo dado conta que há muita força a ser usada para poder controlar a pandemia. Não há necessidade de força. A resistência pode ser quebrada de variadíssimas formas. E um ensaio com os nossos parceiros. Se os governos adotarem, olharem para os princípios que estamos a propor sobre a descriminalização de pequenos delitos, vão perceber que há vários métodos alternativos e nós, inclusive, propomos que essas faixas populacionais sejam trazidas no sentido de colaborarem, eles próprios colaborarem. E isso, as pessoas só colaboram quando perceberem o que é bom, o que é mau e como pode decidir por si. Luísa, é o que eu tinha em relação a estas questões. Fico ao dispor dos participantes para que possam, então, colocar.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, again for your insight. The review of laws to ensure they're proportionate and necessary and respect human dignity is absolutely crucial. You raised issues around oversight of the work of the police. And I love that idea of bringing the people into the centre of this discussion in terms of what are the alternatives. But also what really resonated with me was this issue of ensuring that there is a social response instead of a criminal response. And that is really very much, not just with COVID-19, but very much at the heart of the work of the campaign. And I know that it's been at the heart of the work that the Commission has been doing. And that comes through very clear in the text of the principles on the decriminalisation of petty offences. And I think that there's clearly much work to do for you at the Commission, us at the campaign, to make sure this message is heard by states. You're getting some questions and comments coming in, Commissioner, so we'll address them towards the end when the other panelists have had an opportunity, but thank you. Another thing that was very clear from Commissioner Manuela's intervention is that the principles, as well as previous Commission documents such as the Ouagadougou Declaration, tell us that unnecessary and arbitrary arrest due to petty offences causes prison overcrowding. And this has been an issue very much for us as the campaign. But during this pandemic, when detention overcrowding then takes on a particularly brutal element, given that places of detention can be a vector for the virus, the role of the police in reducing the number of unnecessary arrests has to be a decongestion strategy. So we received a short video from our partners in Malawi, Victor Mahango, who's the director at the Centre for Human Rights Education, Advice and Assistance, that highlights further down this criminal justice chain, what is the impact on those who end up in the prison system? And it's going to resonate for us as we continue our discussion on reducing the opportunities and the incentives to arrest in the first place. So I'm going to share my screen so that we may all see and hear the presentation by Victor. And here we go.
My name is Victor Mahango. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Human Rights Education, Advice and Assistance, CREA in Malawi. The impact that COVID-19 has brought to the prisoners are so many. One of them is that the prisoners are suspended all visitors to come and see their relations in prisons, which means that all the visitors who were relying on food from outside, that they are not accorded that right. And also the right to visit a relative is not there at the moment. The other impact is that all ongoing cases which were supposed to be taken by different magistrates and judges are not taking place because the judiciary are only taking new cases and maybe assisting people on bail applications, but other cases are not taking. The other issue is that the Department of Prison provided for isolation centers, new places for new prisoners, so that they should not mix with the old prisoners. But what is happening at the moment is that all the places, all the prisons that they designated, they are already full. So we are still back to square one. We are coming back to the issue of congestion in our prisons.
Great. So the flow-on effect, where we have arbitrary arrest, arbitrary detention, was also highlighted, and its impact then in terms of prison overcrowding was also highlighted in a video we received from new campaign members in Morocco, the Association Relais, who in this extract from the full clip that we're going to make available on the campaign YouTube channel soon, discusses the issue of the recourse by the judiciary to short or preventative sentences. So again, this is not directly related to the issue of policing, but it demonstrates the challenges experienced once a person enters that justice system and the need to prevent that entry into the justice system from the first place. So if you just bear with me for 1 second, I will play for us that clip.
Fatna El-Bouir, ex-présidente de l'association Relais, membre du bureau de l'association Relais. L'association travaille depuis 2005 dans l'espace carcéral et à l'extérieur avec les ex-détenus et surtout avec les mineurs en situation de conflit avec la loi. Les prisons marocaines sont surpeuplées parce qu'elles ne peuvent pas afficher complet, mais aussi parce que les juges ont recours à des peines courtes ou à des peines des peines préventives de 6 mois, de 3 mois, entre 6 mois et 1 année. Et si on se...
Great. So if we stop people from entering the criminal justice system unnecessarily in the first place, we need to do this by reducing the need to arrest and that incentive for unnecessary and arbitrary arrests. It's always been an issue for the campaign, but it's particularly a critical issue during this COVID-19 pandemic. So on this issue of human rights protection, so right to freedom, security, and freedom from arbitrary arrest, as we heard yesterday, there are many countries in Africa who are enacting states of emergency or disaster to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So this, as we know, brings with it a curtailment of certain human rights, but not all. And we don't need to be constitutional lawyers to understand that it's not all. Annika Meerkotter from the Southern African Litigation Centre, I'd love to bring you in here. So you've co-written a policy brief for the Southern African Litigation Centre entitled A Legal Overview of the Impact of COVID-19 on Justice and Rights in Southern Africa. I'm going to make the link available in the chat now to participants. But in that brief, you highlighted the issue of confusion by the police about their powers under a state of emergency or under a state of disaster, which is quite frankly very troubling and terrifying. Would you be able to explain a little bit more about what your research revealed, Annika?
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Annika, and as Louise said, I wanted to thank her for the introduction. I'm going to follow up from what Commissioner Manuela had said, because she had covered quite a bit about explaining how the police are untrained, that they did not expect what would happen and how they need to act, that they assume a lot more powers than what they necessarily have, and that what we needed instead was a dialogue as opposed to the instruction for police to use force. So following from that, I think if you look at the laws under which various governments have responded to the COVID situation, there seems to be some confusion just in terms of what powers the state have to start off with. So some countries declared states of emergencies, and states of emergency you would normally declare under the Constitution. But under the Constitution, there are also specific requirements. So if you declare if the president declares a state of emergency, normally the Constitution would have some sort of time limit to that. So it would be a 7-week or a 7-day or 14-day or 21-day limit to that state of emergency. And then the extension to the state of emergency should ideally only happen through Parliament, which means that even in states of emergency, there's some sort of parliamentary oversight that's brought in that case. In addition, for example, the international law and the constitutions themselves in most countries have limitations on the extent to which rights can be limited under a state of emergency. So a president can't just declare a state of emergency, say COVID is here, there's a disaster, it's a state of emergency, and the police can do anything. The reality is that both under international law and under the constitutions in most countries, one of the rights that can never be infringed is the right to freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Other rights include the right to freedom from discrimination, the right to life. So there are clear limits to what the police can do. And actually, the police and security forces in general assume that when it comes to a state of emergency, they can actually commit torture. They can actually beat people up as punishment for what they've done. They can actually kill people. I mean, we've seen that in many instances. In South Africa, for example, there was a person who had been beaten to death by the security forces, and his family went to the court simply to ask the court to explain to the police that they can't do what the law says they can't do. So it's not that our laws in our countries don't explain very clearly what the police can't do, and what the security forces can't do, including in states of emergency. But I think it's, as Commissioner Manuela said, that the police are actually, and the security forces are uninformed. They're not reminded of what their duties are when these declarations are made, and they often there's not the guiding documents that's required to actually support them to carry out their duties in a constitutional manner. So example, well, the High Court, for example, in South Africa then ordered the state within 5 days to issue guidelines specifically to the police and to the military on how they should act and what they can and can't do. Now, I think the other confusion that comes in, or let me just start with the state of emergency itself. I think we can't say we were unprepared and therefore we have this excessive use of force by the police, because all states in Africa basically have a legacy of colonialism, a legacy of authoritarian rule, where states of emergencies basically constituted a complete resorting to the use of force, where the rule of law simply didn't apply and the security forces were able to do whatever they want to. So that's the legacy that exists in all our countries. Now, if that legacy exists, we can expect that if we hadn't trained the police on what to do during a state of emergency, that is the first thing that's going to come to their mind. And if they are already quite excessive in their use of force, as many police are, just under normal circumstances, how could we have assumed that they wouldn't be even more excessive in the use of force under a state of emergency? So I think the decisions by states to declare states of emergencies ought to have foreseen the consequences of excessive police use of force. Now, just to separate that, so we have excessive use, we have states of emergencies, but then we also have where countries have declared a public health emergency, a state of disaster. Now, those sort of declarations are made under public health laws or under disaster laws, and that's very different from a state of emergency. But because people say, because the wording sounds quite similar, and because there's not much attention being paid in the media to separating the two concepts, people assume that a state of emergency is the same as a public health emergency or state of disaster. And the truth is it's not, because in terms of what the executive can do, the executive is actually completely limited by the empowering legislation such as the Public Health Act or the Disaster Management Act. And those laws often do not extend to people being able to declare lockdowns to the extent to which they have. And this was recently a point made by the Malawi High Court, where they actually declared the government's lockdown measures unconstitutional on the basis that they far exceeded the narrow powers that the executive were accorded in terms of public health laws to declare emergencies. So there's a lot of legal issues, and I think we can see that many states have grappled with this. So there's been examples where countries have sort of declared a state of emergency, realized they were wrong, then suddenly withdraw that and declare a public health emergency, or the other way around, or they declared both. So there's been a lot of confusion even at government level, but I think that doesn't excuse us from ensuring that the police operate in the way they should, and ensuring that the police are always trained on what to do in any sort of emergency situation, whether it's a state of emergency or a public health situation or natural disaster or whatever it might be. So I think there's lots of issues that have come up that have sort of shown the deficiencies in both our laws, but in how we are able to ensure that the police carry out the law in a manner that respects the rule of law. And I think part of that, just to close, is that the executive has often been complicit in this. We've seen numerous cases across Africa where presidents, ministers, commissioners of police, military commanders have told their soldiers and the police officers that they must enforce the COVID regulations in whatever way necessary and with as much force as is required to ensure that it's enforced. Now, that's completely disproportionate. It doesn't at all acknowledge that they're not allowed to act with excessive force, and it sends the wrong message. So I think the problem is on many different levels, and it's not just the police, but it's also the orders that they were given by their superiors, as Commissioner Manuela also noted in her presentation. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much for that, Annika. As always, incredibly insightful. So that issue, interestingly, of the police being uninformed and not reminded. Firstly, we know generally about their human rights obligations in day-to-day policing, but crucially in these extraordinary circumstances under states of emergency was actually an issue that was picked up by one of one of our campaign partners who submitted a video. So yesterday, and I'm actually going to change the order of the videos I was going to play. Yesterday, we heard from Prawa in Nigeria about the impact there of the COVID-19 regulations. But in the video they submitted to us, they touched on this issue as a lesson and a way forward. So with your indulgence, I'd just like to play the extract that we received from them. Again, I remind everyone that we will make these videos available on our YouTube channel. And I would like just to play this one from this point here.
So what are the lessons learned in this process? The basic lesson is that in spite of the human rights training that these security institutions are engaged with, we find out that when it comes to a period like this, that those that are sent out to go for the actual implementation of laws are not these persons that have received these trainings. And going forward, the recommendation should be that in this type of engagement with the civil society, efforts should be made that those that must lead on this are those that know the human rights principles and standards that are required in the engagement with citizens. And again, the government itself should be careful, in terms of making laws, so that laws do not affect some groups, more than it does to others, and do the needful in terms of providing social security to the people. We thank you.
So there are many of the same themes that we heard during the presentations by Commissioner Manuela and Annika. So I'd like to thank you both. So they've provided us with a sort of an oversight at a regional level. And what I'd like to do now is begin to drill the discussion down to a national level discussion. So I want to turn to our partners in Guinea, Adrian Tossa Moncho from MDT. Bonjour, Adrian. I hope you're there. I wanted to ask you, what has been the experience of specifically of this issue of policing during COVID-19 in Guinea? And is what you're hearing now from Annika, from Commissioner Manuela, resonating with you in terms of that experience? So I'd like to hand it to you. You'll need to unmute your microphone, Adrian.
Merci,
so we're
merci
not,
beaucoup.
I'm not able to hear.
De me donner la parole. Vous m'entendez?
We are now, Adrian. Please go ahead.
Ok, merci de me donner la parole au compte de la Guinée, que je me fais un peu le devoir de rapidement présenter. La Guinée est un pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. C'est un pays francophone qui est en Afrique de l'Ouest, un pays indépendant depuis 1958 et qui est bordé par plusieurs autres pays, dont certains francophones et lusophones, la Guinée-Bissau notamment. Alors, à l'instar des autres pays de la sous-région, la Guinée a un système de santé très fragile, malgré que le pays ait été confronté entre 2014 et 2016 à une grave crise sanitaire, la crise de Ebola, que le monde entier a suivi. L'autre point important, c'est que les différents régimes successifs en Guinée depuis 1958, donc depuis l'indépendance, se sont illustrés dans de graves violations des droits de l'homme. Et cela, notamment par l'intermédiaire justement des forces de défense et de sécurité. Ici, en Guinée, nous parlons des forces de défense et de sécurité, donc ça regroupe plusieurs catégories. Ce n'est pas la police simplement, mais c'est aussi l'armée, c'est aussi la gendarmerie. Donc, toutes ces forces confondues se sont illustrées depuis l'indépendance de la Guinée à travers de graves violations des droits de l'homme. Mon intervention aussi va se pencher sur le développement de la COVID-19. Rapidement, le pays est rentré, la Guinée est rentrée dans la pandémie, notamment le 12 mars 2020. Et depuis cette date, la croissance, elle est très rapide. Toutes les villes, ou quasiment toutes les régions de la Guinée sont aujourd'hui concernées par la pandémie de COVID-19. Sur 33 préfectures, nous avons 33 préfectures en termes de régions administratives, et sur les 33 préfectures, pour mesurer un peu la propagation, seules 5 préfectures ne sont pas touchées à l'heure actuelle par la pandémie. 5 préfectures sur 33. Donc, l'accroissement est très rapide. Moi qui suis ici, je suis un ancien malade. J'ai été touché par la COVID. J'ai passé 17 jours à l'hôpital en traitement et par la grâce de Dieu, je suis aujourd'hui bien portant. Face à cette propagation rapide, il y a eu des mesures qui ont été prises par les autorités, notamment l'état d'urgence qui a été évoqué tout à l'heure. Nous y sommes encore. Nous sommes encore en Guinée dans cet état d'urgence. Et cet état d'urgence qui comporte une série de mesures qui impactent durablement sur le quotidien des populations, malheureusement. On a la fermeture de certaines frontières, l'interdiction des rassemblements, la fermeture des établissements scolaires, la restriction des déplacements, et ensuite le couvre-feu qui commence le soir de 22 h jusqu'à 4 h du matin actuellement, alors qu'au départ c'était déjà de 21 h à 5 h. La fermeture des lieux de culte notamment aussi, la fermeture des bars et restaurants, la fermeture de façon prématurée des marchés qui d'habitude ouvrent du matin jusqu'au soir depuis les états d'urgence successifs qui sont lancés dans le pays. Les marchés doivent fermer prématurément à 16 h. Alors, donc, tout cela a eu des impacts parce que c'est des mesures qui sont prises et qui doivent être appliquées. Qui doit veiller à l'application? C'est la police, les forces de défense et de sécurité qui doivent veiller. Donc, les mesures ont déjà en elles-mêmes beaucoup d'impact sur les populations. Impact notamment déjà sur les services de santé, parce que les services de santé sont actuellement peu fréquentés. Beaucoup de personnes, les populations ont peur d'aller dans les services de santé, dans les hôpitaux, craignant il y a la négligence des autres maladies au niveau de ces services de santé. Le regard est focalisé actuellement sur la COVID-19, donc les autres maladies sont délaissées. L'impact, c'est sur la fermeture des marchés dont j'ai parlé tout à l'heure et qui, à Menus, était déjà touché de façon beaucoup plus importante par la pauvreté en Guinée. L'impact, c'est aussi sur le service public de la justice. Depuis la pandémie, en mars, il y a une suspension en termes des audiences pénales au niveau des cours et tribunaux. Et cela a un impact énorme, en ce sens que cela agit sur l'accroissement de la détention illégale. En termes de détention, il y a des délais qui sont prévus par les lois en Guinée. Puisque les audiences sont suspendues, puisque les détenus sont en attente de jugement, alors la détention préventive est prolongée alors que les textes l'interdisent. Il y a aussi l'impact sur les petits producteurs agricoles. Les petits producteurs agricoles qui sont exportateurs, notamment, je veux parler des producteurs de pommes de terre. En moyenne Guinée, on produit beaucoup de pommes de terre qui est exportée beaucoup plus vers le Sénégal d'ailleurs. Donc, ces petits producteurs agricoles sont durement impactés par la COVID-19 puisqu'ils ne peuvent plus exporter et avoir les revenus habituels. Un impact très fort, c'est sur les transports en commun. Les mesures prises par les autorités ont demandé à des transporteurs en commun de réduire considérablement le nombre de passagers à bord des véhicules. Les conducteurs de taxi moto, il y en a beaucoup en Guinée, dans toutes les villes de la Guinée, il y en a qui sont durablement aussi impactés. Et là, cela s'est aggravé par la non. Il y a eu beaucoup de demandes dans ce sens. Probablement, le prix à la pompe, cela n'a pas été aussi suivi que cela. L'impact, c'est aussi sur les travailleurs du secteur privé. Le secteur privé, notamment les écoles privées, qui utilisent beaucoup de jeunes diplômés sans emploi qui se sont reconvertis dans l'enseignement. Les écoles privées sont fermées. Les promoteurs d'écoles ne payent plus.
Sorry, Adrian, we're coming very close to the end of your time. So I just wanted to alert you. And just ask if you could comment on that issue of the impact of the enforcement by police of the restrictions, just because we have a little remaining time.
Okay. L'impact de la police, c'est justement sur les petits commerçants, les vendeurs ambulants qui sont souvent arrêtés, embarqués dans des véhicules de police et déposés pour ne recouvrer leur liberté que lorsqu'ils auraient payé une forte somme. Le décret instituant le décret d'état d'urgence, au début, avait parlé d'un montant d'une amende de 30 000 francs guinéens qu'il faut payer lorsque la police vous arrête pour le non-port de la bavette. Lorsque vous ne portez pas le masque, la police vous arrête. Le montant à payer, c'était prévu 30 000 francs. Mais lorsque vous êtes arrêté, les petits vendeurs ambulants qui sont arrêtés à longueur de journée, il leur est demandé de payer généralement jusqu'à 500 000 francs guinéens. C'est énorme. Il y a des femmes, les femmes au marché qui sont aussi victimes parce que l'heure de la fermeture, c'est-à-dire 16 heures, lorsque une femme n'a pas respecté l'heure, on vient saisir, la police vient saisir ses marchandises. Il y a aussi l'impact sur les conducteurs de véhicules. Lorsqu'ils sont arrêtés parce qu'ils ont dépassé le nombre de passagers prévus, alors le véhicule est envoyé à la fourrière et on leur demande de payer de fortes sommes. L'impact aussi, c'est sur les tenanciers, les propriétaires, les gérants de bars et de restaurants qui sont fermés, qui devraient être fermés. Mais c'est leur travail, c'est leur quotidien, c'est avec ça que ces gens-là nourrissent leur famille. Donc certains ouvrent et ils sont arrêtés par la police. Des gens sont arrêtés parfois même présentés à la télévision, notamment. Le droit à l'image quand même n'est pas respecté. Donc, il y a tous ces abus qui sont pauvres. Les petits commerçants, les véhicules de transport en commun, les femmes des marchés sont les principales victimes au niveau de la Guinée pour ce qui concerne les abus de la police. Or, aucune situation ne peut justifier la violation de ces droits. Aucune situation, aussi urgente soit-elle que la COVID, ne justifie la violation des droits. Les droits, qu'ils soient civils et politiques, qu'ils soient économiques, sociaux et culturels ou environnementaux, doivent être respectés dans les normes. Je vous remercie. Merci.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was very, very insightful. And I'm sorry that we don't have all the time to continue that. But it's very interesting to me that you highlighted the type of people by trade or by status who are going to be most, or who are being most impacted by COVID-19 regulation enforcement. And they include the same type of categories of people who are most impacted generally by petty offences. And this makes me I actually want to play a video now from our partners in Uganda just in a moment, because what they have found in Uganda, similarly to what you're seeing in Guinea, is that COVID-19 regulations have the potential to be used as an excuse to kind of further marginalise and further make vulnerable those who are already on the margins of society, or who eke out a living doing things like vending and hawking, which are already kind of situations that make people vulnerable to police conduct. So I'd like to just play that clip, if you just give me a moment to set it up, from Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum in Uganda.
COVID-19 restrictions in Uganda virtually affected everyone in the country. Everyone. However, there are groups that were much more affected by these regulations because of their particular vulnerabilities. These, of course, include the poor, but also include those people that are often marginalized and mostly criminalized by the law. These include LGBTI persons, sex workers, and drug users, the very same groups that Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum primarily serves. One case that stood out for us during the COVID-19 lockdown period in Uganda was the case involving the arrest of 20 LGBT youth who were picked up from a shelter for homeless LGBT persons. They were subjected to beatings by the local council authorities led by the mayor of Chengerwa Town Council. They were tied together like slaves in one long row and marched to the police post, which was more than a kilometer away. At the police post, their statements were taken. They had little access to food, and also they had limited access to their relatives and even lawyers. Eventually, after 2 days at the police post, they were remanded to prison in Kitaya prison, which had been identified as the COVID-19 sort of isolation center. In prison, they suffered violence. They were beaten. One of them was burnt with a burning piece of wood between their thighs, just because they were regarded as homosexuals. They were subjected to taunts and abuses, and for 42 days, their lawyers absolutely had no access to them because the prison authorities had stated that they wouldn't allow access because of COVID-19. It took us a protracted court battle to get them released. We had to go to court and demand for their release, and this was done, a court order was issued after 42 days of their detention. Eventually, after 50 days in jail, the charges against them were dropped, because originally there was no reason why they had to be arrested. If you come to think of it, the major reason, the only reason why they were being picked up is because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And COVID-19 regulations were being used as an excuse by the authorities to clamp down on this group of people. So yes, since that COVID-19 happened, they don't happen to all of us the same way.
So it's quite a sobering story and an important intervention there made by our partners at HRAP in Uganda. So we know from our own work as campaign members, as people interested in the subject matter, that enforcement can have that impact on specific groups. So we heard about the traders in Adrian's presentation. We've heard about LGBTI persons impacted in Uganda. And these are people who are generally already marginalised in society. I want to play just one more clip at this juncture from our campaign partners at the International Drug Policy Consortium. And this brings into stark relief a point that Commissioner Manuela was making earlier in her presentation, which is that if we fail to take a social response, a health response, and instead take a punitive justice, or not even justice, a punitive enforcement response to what is a public health crisis, and a securitized response, we end up with a cascade effect of human rights violations. And this is not just in terms of COVID-19, but it's a point that the campaign makes with regards to petty offences generally. So I just want to play this clip from our partners at the IDPC, which makes the point, I think, quite saliently on the issue of persons who use drugs and how they've been disproportionately impacted by enforcement, where it was a securitized response and not a public health response. So if you just give me a moment, I will set that up.
Thank you very much for giving IDPC the opportunity to be part of this virtual conference. IDPC is a global network of NGOs that promotes drug policies that are grounded on public health, human rights, and social justice. Reports from drug user communities have indicated negative impact of policing on their lives as a result of police officers trying to enforce the restrictions measures that have been put in place by governments to curb the pandemic. In the bid of trying to enforce the lockdown restrictions that have been put in place by governments as measures to address the pandemic, many of these people, especially street-based drug users, have been forced into makeshift shelters where they have been kept there without basic needs and supplies. For instance, opioids to help them address issues around withdrawals and all that. And attempts by many of these people to flee from such environments have been met with police actions that have been violent. What we need to understand is that people who use drugs cannot overnight stop using their drugs. They will definitely need to access them. And in the bid to try and access these measures or these medications to make their lives much better, police officers have taken very strict measures against them, and that has led to violations of the rights of these people. What we need to understand as governments and stakeholders is that we need to begin to look at this issue of drug from the lens of health and welfare other than repression and punishment. We need to begin to support these people, give them the opportunity to be able to access life-saving services and also trying to protect their lives under this pandemic. We need to support and not punish them. Thank you.
So very much to the point there on that issue of securitization versus taking a public health or a social response to this issue. And this securitized response is very, very evident from where I'm speaking to you now. So hello, I didn't say that I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. So I want to speak now with my colleague, Themba Masuku. South Africa took what was described in some quarters as a very decisive approach to COVID-19 regulation enforcement by sending the military alongside the police out into the communities from day one of our lockdown. So it signalled an intention by South Africa to take a punitive approach to public health regulation compliance. And I'm wondering, Themba, I mean, I've got multiple layers of question here, so I'll just put it out and we can follow up. But what does this say about the way the executive views the capacity and the competency of the police to manage this crisis? Why did they send the military in together with the police? What was the impact on the poor and marginalised? And why do it in a way that you're going to end up with those who are on the receiving end of those who are anyway victims of heavy-handed responses by the police, given South Africa's current and history. So I want to hand it to you, Themba, if you could deal with that issue for us.
Yes, thank you very much, Louise. Good afternoon to everyone who has joined in. And thank you for the question and the opportunity to share my thoughts on this topic. I think some of the issues that you're asking me were well dealt with by my colleagues who presented yesterday on the impact of policing in South Africa. But perhaps let me start by providing some context by indicating that the deployment of the military, which was done to perform policing duties is provided for in our constitution. The constitution empowers the president to deploy the army and really requires that in doing so, you must promptly inform parliament and provide appropriate detail. The president is not required is required to provide reasons for such deployment, but whether the reasons are rational or not is not a requirement. The 1996 white paper provides some very useful criteria in terms of the deployment of the South African National Defence Force. And it says that such deployment must be done in extreme or exceptional circumstances, such as when there's complete breakdown of public order beyond the capacity of the South African police services, or when we've reached a state of national defense. We saw that in 2008, when the wave of xenophobic violence erupted throughout the country, when the SNTF was deployed, that only happened when it became apparent that the SAPS could no longer contain the situation on their own. In this instant, you have rightfully indicated that on day one, the South African National Defence Force was deployed together with the police to enforce what the government described at the time as hard lockdown. And it was pretty hard lockdown to a lot of people, but it was worse to marginalized and poor communities. To bolster the enforcement of the regulations, the president announced the deployment of over 76,000 soldiers, in addition to over 102,000 visible police officers. And the visible officers are police officers that are generally trained in general policing. This was far.
Sorry, Temba, could I stop you there? I've just been told that there's an issue with the French translation. I'm really sorry. I'm seeing if I can get it sorted out for you. May we live in interesting times. So I'm just waiting for an indication from the technical team that the French translation has been sorted out.
Okay.
Sorry, Temba.
Not a problem.
This is one of the challenges, as Commissioner Manuela pointed out, of our strange new world. We could have a webinar on this alone. I'm just waiting for some indication from technical that this is being sorted out. Can I get some indication? Okay, great. So you can continue. Sorry about that, Temba. Please go ahead.
Not a problem. So I just indicated that the deployment of the military in South Africa was the largest deployment that had ever taken place in the democratic era. And it signaled from government that it was never going to be business as usual. A punitive or zero tolerance approach was taken to manage an emerging public health crisis. A punitive approach, usually when it's adopted in this manner, it's usually based on the notion that individuals or communities are likely to misbehave, and less robust, tough controls or measures are adopted, and punishment is meted against those who do not toe the line. To reinforce this message, the Minister of Police was providing almost weekly or monthly updates regarding the successes of the security forces in enforcing the lockdown regulations. The sending of the military was not only decisive, but was also aimed at signaling government intention that it was serious about reducing the spread of the infections. However, this deep-seated culture is evident in how the government deal with the poor and marginalized communities, in that punitive approach is often a common strategy to maintain political and social control. It is also a strategy preferred by governments to criminalize, discipline, punish inappropriate behavior and non-compliance. In South Africa, to ensure a complete lockdown, our minister ordered the setting up of more than 190 roadblocks on major highways, roads and over 680 checkpoints across the country. The country was indeed in complete lockdown, as one could not travel a kilometer without being stopped by law enforcement or security agencies patrolling the streets and manning the roadblocks. The minister also directed the police and the security forces to destroy any selling of liquor and demand receipts for any person smoking. As a result, the livelihoods of mostly informal traders and small businesses in the townships were severely affected. The government punitive or zero tolerance approach to the lockdown regulations was hard on the poor and marginalized, who could not buy commodities in bulk. Within weeks following the lockdown, photos and videos of brutality in the townships began to circulate on social media. Water cannons, tear gas, rubber bullets were deployed to disperse people, at times peacefully queuing outside shops. The poor and homeless people, whose only means of survival was being on the streets, bore the most brunt, as the securitization of the pandemic meant that these people had to find alternative means of survival and places to stay, as it became an offense to be on the streets without a valid permit issued by authorities. Heavy fines impacted largely the poor and marginalized. Within the first 7 days of lockdown, over 2,000 people had been arrested for breaking the lockdown regulations. The effect was that by August, over 300,000 people had been arrested and fined, mostly for minor infringements, including, for instance, being outdoor without a permit, in possession of alcohol, a cigarette without a receipt. A total of 28,000 civilians, over 28,000 were found guilty or pleaded guilty, and about over 180,000 were released on a warning to appear in court for contravening the Disaster Management Act. All civilians arrested, some of them young, unemployed, facing economic hardships, when convicted, will carry criminal records, which will further punish them, which will further push them to the margins of society as they face bleak prospects of finding jobs in the formal sector. About 10 civilians, all Black, were killed by security forces for violating lockdown regulations. The arrest of mostly Black, poor people who were struggling during these lockdown regulations justifiably prompted public outcry from civil society organizations, and the United Nations warned that excessive policing and enforcement of hard lockdowns and curfew could spark a human rights disaster. The deployment of the military was not a signal of confidence in the police. The government did not think the police had the capacity to enforce the lockdown regulations and the curfew. The military deployment was the largest in the history of South African democracy. The SNDF was deployed to contain the virus and save lives. The opposite, in some instances, was achieved. The military was deployed to perform. Some of these responsibilities included protecting quarantine sites and delivering food and other essential supplies to mass storage facilities, help the police restrict movement, conduct roadblocks, and to curtail unrest. The deployment of the military to perform policing duties or be a force multiplier was going to encounter several challenges. The first point to make is that not even all police units were deployed during this lockdown. For instance, specialized police units such as the Special Task Force and the Technical Response Unit of the SAPS are not deployed to perform general policing duties. If they are, it will be in exceptional circumstances. The military basically fall within that category. The use of the military to deal with dissent is not a new phenomenon in South Africa. The military was used during apartheid to police townships as part of its counterinsurgency operations and to deal with dissent and any opposition to white minority rule. While the deployment of the military is provided for in the Constitution, it should only be in exceptional circumstances. The presence of the military invokes a lot of pain, trauma, and anger in many Black townships who suffered tragedies at the hands of the military. There's not been a process of healing in several of these communities who were abused by military operations. The military, again, is not trained to conduct policing duties, neither do they have the right equipment to perform policing duties. The police are trained and equipped to maintain law and order and to enforce the law. The military is not suited to fight an invincible enemy, such as the coronavirus. The military is trained and equipped and mandated to protect the country from foreign attack. Its conduct during its operations are evident, which resulted in the deaths of many civilians. The military doctrine is different from the police doctrine. Militaries are funded, educated, and trained in warfare against an enemy of the state. The deployment of the military in Black townships was definitely going to cause a number of tragedies, and a total of 12 civilians were murdered in the process. Thank you, Louise.
Oh, Gossa, thank you. Temba, thank you. I was just messaging Gossa. Look, one of the issues for me that's come out of your presentation here is this question or this sharing the fact that the Minister of Police would publicly comment on the success of the security forces in the enforcement of these measures. And given the context that we're dealing with, and given how challenging, brutal, and militarized the enforcement response has been, I think that raises really serious questions in terms of democratic policing and what we say is a successful response, not just in terms of a public health crisis. So thank you very much, Temba. Sort of speaking as well from South Africa, it's been quite stark because the experience that you have shared in terms of what we know has happened in marginalized and disadvantaged communities is very different to the experience that I've had as a middle-class person sitting in the Cape Town suburbs, and that can't highlight that issue of the disparity in terms of impact of enforcement. So thank you very much, Temba. We're coming up to 3:45 South African time, which gives us about 45 minutes. So we've got one more question that I wanted to pose, and then we're going to open it up. So keep your questions coming. We will have a Q&A session after our last presentation. And as we are nearing the end of our session, I really want to reflect on that issue of lessons learned. And I know we've touched on it in terms of Commissioner Manuela's reflection on systemic kind of issues and advice she would give to states. But here now, I want to keep it at a national level and turn to our friends in Sierra Leone. And in particular, our partners at Advocate. So Lydia, Sierra Leone, as we heard from Adrian in terms of Guinea as well, is unfortunately not a stranger to a public health crisis, having endured the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Lydia, do you think that the Sierra Leone police force reflected on the past experience in terms of the enforcement of the curfews and the regulations you had during the Ebola crisis? and were prepared for the public health crisis that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll hand it to you, Lydia.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening in from. My name is Lydia. I'm the legal manager at Advocate Sierra Leone. Louise and all the other panelists, thank you very much for your presentations. And of course, without a doubt, I know that COVID has had a disproportionate negative effect on all the vulnerable in our communities. And to give credit to the public, at least after the Ebola crisis, they were not as much as misinformed when it came to issues of maybe like lockdown. There was more of less resistance to that. But I can just say for the police, it was unfortunate that they were not as prepared, seeing as this was a crisis that didn't even come with any form of manual that was new. But the measures that they put in place, of course, really exposed and exploited inequalities in our communities. And of course, with the major trade-offs between human rights protection and the balance to ensure public health, the deep effects, of course, distinctively were disproportionate to the poor and the marginalized in our community. For example, during the lockdowns that were there early April and early May, there were very many cases of police arresting people who wanted to buy bread, for example, and just walking to a bakery because it's a lockdown where they were doing contact tracing by the government. And you realize that these are the same people who cannot afford to stock up food for all those days. But then the arrest, of course, is counterproductive to the fact that, you know, the places are overcrowded, the detention places are overcrowded, they are not as hygienic. And this, of course, is not a measure that you intend to take to curb a public health emergency. We had issues to do with market women getting arrested for trying to make sales in the evening, which of course has a ripple effect in terms of ladies who have to pay off some loans that they get. And then of course they get back into the cycle of, you know, having to borrow again to pay off a debt, or even failing because they cannot be able to pay off their monies that they had put into their businesses, and then have to get arrested by police. And then the cycle continues. Commercial sex workers were really, really affected by this as well because of curfew, and they could not move. Even currently, it's still an issue because curfew is 11 p.m. now. It was extended from 9 p.m. originally when the pandemic was in Sierra Leone, and there was initial measures put in place by the president, though the state of emergency is still running for a year. Curfew now is 11, and some of these women have to stay where they are from about 11 till 5 a.m. in the morning, meaning they are exposed to violence because they are unable to get paid for the services they will offer after 11 p.m. as they have to stay in the same place till the next day. And at times, of course, police does not, even if they are beaten up and they report, police does not treat them as they would. And at times, some of them end up having to be accused of stealing some of the items from the complainants who are the people, the same people that the commercial sex workers are supposed to be reporting. And of course, we had issues during the lockdown where women needed to fetch water. As we all know, water in Sierra Leone during the dry season is the problem. But then in effect, they are stopped from fetching water, and which was a necessity and still is in this season of COVID, where actually for you to survive and not to have a risk of exposure, you need to have, of course, water to keep clean. And of course, our call to governments, currently our government officials and stakeholders to release prisoners has really been slow. And the presidential pardons have not actually been out to release specific vulnerable prisoners, but only those who are pardoned by the Presidential Pardon on Independence Day. And now we look at an alarming rising number of cases for women and even men, except that Advocate intervenes a lot for women. I think you saw the video in the beginning where a lady was arrested for not wearing a face mask. We're having very many cases, and they are definitely the poor of the community. One of them had forgotten her face mask at home. She hawks cola nut and about her business capital is about 30,000 Leon, which is about $3. And then she's expected to pay 20,000, and she had to borrow money, but had spent a whole day in detention. So we see cases like that where the measures that are being put into place by police are counterproductive to the fact that we know that there is a balance that is needed to ensure safety of the public health, but also that there should be a balance to protect human rights during this time. So some of the measures that police have put up, of course, are not as necessary, not proportionate, they are discriminatory, and of course, not compliant with national, regional, and international human rights standards.
Gosh, thanks, thanks, Lydia. It's, I don't want to end on that note, though we note the amazing work that Advocate has been doing. So if we can move to this idea of lessons learned and what we can do practically speaking. So like I said at the beginning of the question, we've heard from Commissioner Manuela on the systemic stuff, but I want to play a clip before I ask my question fully that describes some of the important work that you as Advocate, and you've alluded to it in your answer, but you as Advocate are doing at a police station level on this issue. The full clip will be available for everyone to see on the YouTube channel soon, but I'm just going to play from about halfway through where your paralegal describes some of the work that Advocate has been doing in terms of the police and their engagement. So just give me a moment and I will share my screen.
In response to this, Advocate has been going on down monitoring. We've been on monitoring at the police stations and the correctional centers. We also give donation to the CC and also the police station in supporting the prevention of COVID by making donations of liquid hand wash and sanitizers and also other materials that are necessary for this prevention of COVID. At the police station, we talk to the police officers to give non-custodial sentencing, mainly for these people to be cautioned and released and bails to be granted rather than them being over-detained and kept at the police station, which is also a risk for COVID. And also been coming out with press releases, calling on the government to make sure that inmates that are detained for minimal offences, for minor offences are being released or given a bail term, that they are going out to their families also. And in regards to the legal aid and the psychosocial area, because we've been given strict restrictions in accessing the CC, we come up with our forms that we give to the officers there to help filling for any inmate. And also we make one-on-one phone calls. So these are the responses that Advocate has been giving out, and this is the work that Advocate does. Thanks for listening, and thank you once more.
So, Lydia, I mean, this type of work is, to me, very exciting. It describes initiatives by Advocate that directly assists victims of police abuse and violence during COVID-19, and measures that you take in relation to directly assisting the police to improve the responses. So could you elaborate a bit on this work that you're doing at that institutional and at that station level? Because it seems to me that there's a really excellent good practice example of a police community engagement that we could all benefit from hearing about, and end our panel on a high note to hear about the work of campaign members to try and right these wrongs.
Thank you, Louise. We have, as Advocate, had to adopt and change our work and develop new ways to ensure that our continued support to women and girls in conflict with the law continues, because we have restricted access, especially to correctional centers, and we had to adopt our legal and psychosocial support, for example. And for this, I can say we have been able to do this and have been building on the good relationship that Advocate has had and enjoyed with the Sierra Leone Police and Sierra Leone Correctional Service. We have changed, instead of having to access our clients directly, we've been able to format some forms and come up with a way that the officers can be able to fill that form for us and give us information of detainees. And then we pick them once a week, or depending on who is going to be able to come into court, or if it's the social worker or the legal paralegal, they alternate and pick the forms from the correctional centers, and then are able to see what are the most urgent needs that our clients need and be able to provide interventions. Also, our social workers and paralegals are able to inquire about the women's welfare needs that they have and able to provide psychosocial support on speakerphones and talk to the women, and that's how we have adapted in this current situation. Engaging police, I can say that we have been able to engage with the support also of OSIWA with different stakeholders in who are able to make decisions on behalf of like police. We have talked to like someone in the Directorate of Gender. We have talked to the Minister of Gender and the Minister of Internal Affairs as well on how best we can see women and children who are impacted by COVID can be able to have the measures that are put into place not affecting them disproportionately. Engaging the police actually was something that also came out already before the outbreak of the coronavirus in Sierra Leone. Engaging the police, engaging the CCs on issues of overcrowding was something we had been highlighting in our work. So we started actively now engaging station sergeants to ensure the use of non-custodial measures, so that at this point, the risk to police officers, the risk to the detention detainees is cut down, because we know that overcrowding, much as this has been really a worldwide problem that the COVID just lifted off the lid, we know that now with our intervention, we have realized that there are some times when our paralegals and social workers may go to some correctional detention places, especially police, and realize that there are no suspects, because this engagement for them to realize and create awareness and engage them and tell them that detaining some people for just having maybe assault or loitering or having a fight in public is counterproductive to the whole issue of preventing a public health crisis. Then Advocate has also been able to call on government through press releases that we have put out, inviting independent monitors to get into detention facilities, especially that we have restricted access. And as Advocate, we also were able to access passes, so that during the lockdowns, where there was restricted movement, we are able to intervene on behalf of people who are arrested for breaking curfew laws, people who are not able to, who are walking around to get water or bread or food, and able to have them not stay in detention. And for this time, it was not only just females, but even the male suspects were released from prison due to our intervention. As well as that, we have been able to also have ad hoc donations given to these organizations, and particularly government institutions that we work with, police and the correctional centers, I know that they have restricted resources, and when an emergency public health crisis like this one comes in, and we know that much as the female incarcerated population is small, it is often the one that is neglected. So though our resources were restricted, we have managed through the support of OSIWA to distribute some face masks, some food items, sanitation items, so that these women are able to keep in hygienic places, but also not only for the detainees, but also the police stations in themselves and correctional centers. We have provided for the people who work in those services and in charge of detainees to be able to have urgently needed welfare items like hand washing stations, sanitizers, soap, to be able to keep at bay the outbreak of the virus in prison. So that is what Advocate has done to adjust its work during this crisis, and we're committed to developing new strategies and develop new ways and creative ways to ensure that we now do not criminalize COVID-19, but continue to protect and promote human rights during this pandemic, to ensure that measures that are being put in place are necessary, they are proportionate, non-discriminatory, and compliant with our national, regional, and international standards. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I'm really glad that we've finished on that note, because it has been a challenging discussion, just in terms of how many aspects of the policing and the enforcement we haven't managed to get right. I want to play our last clip. What you've said in terms of that direct assistance to the police, as well as working at the systemic level, actually was echoed in a video that we got from Penal Reform International from their office in Central African Republic. And they discussed some of the technical assistance that they've been providing to prisons and how important this has been, not just in terms of the COVID management, as you've talked about, the virus spread, but in terms of improving human rights. And respect for human rights under the emergency. So I want to end this part of the session with that clip. So while it's not about police, it is about prisons. It's going to hopefully get everybody thinking about the type of interventions that can be done at that station level, at that institutional level, as well as the sort of more systemic state level to begin to improve. So with your indulgence, I'm going to play this final clip. It is in French, so please make sure you've got your translation. It is from Central African Republic. Here we go.
L'intervention des partenaires techniques et financiers tels que Penal Reform International a permis de mettre à la disposition de l'administration pénitentiaire et des établissements pénitentiaires plusieurs kits de protection, plusieurs kits d'hygiène, et également a permis d'assurer des séances de formation au profit des personnels pénitentiaires, que ce soit le personnel civil ou le personnel militaire. Cela a également permis de conduire des campagnes de sensibilisation au profit des détenus des différents établissements pénitentiaires en vue de l'observation et de l'application des mesures barrières. Et donc, pour le cas spécifique de Penal Reform International, sa mobilisation et son engagement a permis que la société civile centrafricaine, qui a mis en place une plateforme pour soutenir les efforts de réforme en matière pénitentiaire, a eu à conduire des séances de formation au profit des prisons situées à Bangui, notamment la maison centrale de Ngargba, qui est la principale prison du pays, et aussi la prison pour femmes de Bimbo. Ces séances de formation ont été accompagnées par la remise de kits d'hygiène au profit des personnes détenues. Ces efforts, Penal Reform International entend les poursuivre dans d'autres provinces à l'extérieur de la capitale lorsque les mesures, les conditions sanitaires ainsi que les mesures sécuritaires seront favorables.
Great. So that highlights to us, and I hope we're ending the panel discussion component of this on a high note, in terms of the impact that we can have on some of the challenges that we have discussed. What I want to do now is to open it up for conversation. We've been asking you throughout this session to please give your thoughts, your comments and your questions using the Q&A, and I see that that has happened, and also the chat box. The way we're going to structure this is we're actually going to borrow from Lucas's technique yesterday, which worked quite nicely, is to give each of our panelists 5 minutes to directly respond to questions or comments received on the chat that affected them or were posed to them, or to raise any other issues or to respond to any other issues raised by their fellow panelists. So it's very much an open session. Use the 5 minutes as you would like. I'm going to ask, we'll start with Commissioner Manuela. Commissioner Manuela, I'm going to ask Gossar from APCOF to read out the 3 comments and questions that were directed at you so that you have the benefit of the Portuguese translation, and then give you the opportunity if you would like to make any further comment or to respond to that. So Gossar, I'll hand to you initially.
Thank you very much, Louise. There is only one question that has been directed at Commissioner Manuela, and a participant wants to hear her views on how individuals who have suffered in the hands of politicians and security agents can effectively hold them accountable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gossar. So Commissioner Manuela, I'm not sure if you got that question, but if you would like an opportunity, please, to respond or to make any other remarks before we conclude today.
Obrigada, Luís. Muito obrigada a todos. Realmente está a ser uma experiência muito interessante. Se não for a Covid e pudéssemos, na África do Sul, tal como tínhamos programado, fisicamente discutir estas questões, seria muito, muito, muito bom. Mas, infelizmente, nas novas contingências, temos que nos adequar. Vou começar pelo que me perguntaram. Como é que pessoas que tenham sofrido abusos da polícia, e a polícia é um órgão do governo, do Estado, como é que podem responsabilizá-los? E, consecutivamente, responsabilizar o Estado, claro. Eu devo dizer que, no final da minha intervenção, eu dizia que os Estados devem permitir a criação de órgãos de supervisão civil. Porque eu sei que a nível das polícias, maior parte das polícias, há órgãos para onde se podem enviar queixas. São as inspeções, são as auditorias, têm vários nomes de acordo com o país e de acordo com a região. Mas eu sei que há um espaço onde o cidadão pode perfeitamente apresentar a queixa. Também sei, até porque sou cidadã africana e do mundo, eu sei que queixas apresentadas nesses órgãos, que são órgãos de estrutura oficial, raramente surtem o efeito desejado. Não quer dizer que nunca. Há casos em que os efeitos surgem e os agentes são punidos. Mas temos que contar sempre com o corporativismo. Não sei como é que isso se diz em inglês, mas eu não quero ficar mal e investigar um assunto em que está o meu colega. Eu quero manter-me, porque amanhã posso ser eu nessa posição. A isto nós em português chamamos de corporativismo, e nós sabemos que existe isto de corporativismo na polícia também, assim como em outros órgãos. Então, a forma de nós denunciarmos e para podermos obter alguma reparação, porque um abuso a uma dignidade, esteve a senhora a dizer que as 20 meninas que são da LGBT foram levadas para uma polícia onde foram violadas, estas nunca terão uma reparação patrimonial. Tudo que se pode fazer é tentar reparar a ofensa moral, a dignidade dela que foi tocada neste assunto. Então, eu penso que quando isto ocorrer, eu digo sempre às pessoas que me perguntam quando abordamos isto, que deve existir um caminho onde as pessoas devem estar à vontade para colocar as questões. Se não pode ser diretamente para o órgão da polícia, porque estamos a temer o corporativismo, temos as nossas ONGs, temos a sociedade civil, temos a sociedade de advogados, para poderem obrigar o Estado a investigar. E investigado de forma independente. Por quê? Porque se nós tivermos uma assessoria técnica para nos acompanhar, provavelmente a possibilidade de êxito é maior do que sermos nós próprios a tomar o nosso assunto por nossa própria mão. Primeiro porque nós temos um grande envolvimento com isto e às vezes não raciocinamos o suficiente. Então, é melhor ter um técnico ao lado. Também devo dizer, e digo sempre isto, que quando estes abusos ocorrem, o primeiro lugar onde as pessoas devem socorrer-se não deve ser a mídia. A mídia deve ser ali, por quê? Porque depois há vestígios que desaparecem. Deve-se contactar os órgãos, dependendo de cada país e de cada sistema jurídico, com um advogado, com um assistente jurídico, dirigindo-se ao sítio correto, falo de Angola, dirigindo-se à Procuradoria-Geral Militar para poder colocar as coisas, encontrar provas, porque também há muitos que alegam violações do seu direito pela polícia e não sabem provar. Nem toda abordagem da polícia deve ser entendida como um abuso, porque a polícia tem um mister a cumprir. Tem uma missão a cumprir. Então, estas abordagens abusivas, estas violações que aparecem na abordagem entre polícia e civil, devem ser acompanhadas para depois serem declaradas verdadeira violação e poder o agente ser punido, porque indo para a mídia não resolvemos muito. É verdade que é uma forma de divulgar para dar a conhecer que existiu isto e aquilo, mas se nós pudermos primeiro obter apoio jurídico e para podermos ir ao judicial para que sejamos efetivamente, para que os agentes sejam efetivamente punidos. E todos sabemos que a punição tem duas vertentes. A punição com a prevenção geral, para que os outros agentes não tornem a fazer a mesma coisa, e é isto que estamos a pedir aos Estados, e a punição efetiva daquele que violou o direito. No meu entendimento, desta forma nós conseguimos. E quando, terminado todo o processo interno, não conseguirmos esta reparação, temos os órgãos internacionais. Mas, terminado e concluído todo o sistema interno sem que o assunto seja resolvido. Porque os sistemas internacionais têm a cláusula do esgotamento das instâncias internas. Isto em relação a como é que os indivíduos que podem sofrer abusos podem ser ressarcidos. Eu devo agradecer, Luiz, esta prática boa da Advocate da Serra Leoa, muito interessante, uma abordagem completamente diferente do mesmo assunto. Por isso é que eu digo que tivemos partilhas importantíssimas. É uma abordagem diferente da agressividade que os órgãos da ordem e segurança públicas têm. É uma boa prática. A formação do próprio agente é uma boa prática. A partilha, a abordagem, a nossa abordagem também deve ser uma abordagem respeitosa. Isto não está bem. E nós, na nossa abordagem, e eu digo sempre isto às pessoas, devemos ater-nos aos factos e não atingir pessoas, porque eles também têm os seus direitos. Eles também têm os seus direitos. Vamos ater-nos à violação, ao facto que constituiu violação do meu direito. Não devo criar condição para atacar pessoas diretamente só porque o meu direito foi violado. Portanto, eu admiro esta abordagem da Lídia. Os meus parabéns à Serra Leoa. Também a abordagem aqui do Uganda. Uma boa experiência. Eles no final de tudo, agora, estas pessoas devem intentar uma ação contra os agentes da ordem, porque, em última instância, nós vamos atingir o Estado. Não sei a nível dos outros países, mas na Constituição do meu país diz que quando um agente da ordem pública viola, comete crimes, para além dele indemnizar, portanto, o Estado, o próprio Estado, entra para indemnizar primeiro todos os abusos cometidos pelos seus agentes, e depois o Estado vai se ver com o seu agente, e tem resultado em muitas exonerações. Este é outro assunto que também cria violência, porque estas pessoas que são exoneradas e que são deixadas ao seu critério têm formação militar e militarizada. Cria outros problemas, também temos que cuidar destes. São estes os meus comentários, Luísa, nos meus 5 minutos, espero não ter excedido muito.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Manuela. So we really do appreciate the efforts of the African Commission and of your, as you as a special rapporteur on prisons, conditions of detention and policing in Africa, to promote that agenda of police accountability, because without accountable policing, the training is for nothing. Without accountable policing, we're going to continue to see human rights abuses on the scales that we see them. And I do hope that next year we do have that opportunity to meet in Cape Town. So it's planned for 2021 to allow for more natural exchanges on the sidelines of these panel discussions. But we very much thank you for participating, Commissioner. I want to give the other panelists a few minutes to respond to issues raised. Annika from South, would you like to make a response?
Eu é que devo agradecer, Luísa, e vamos ver se com a PCOF ainda conseguimos organizar uma conferência dessa natureza para os países falantes de língua portuguesa só, porque temos muito poucos ali. Vamos ver qual é a possibilidade que há. Até dezembro ou janeiro, nos próximos meses, vamos ver qual é a possibilidade que temos. É muito, muito importante este tipo de participação da própria comunidade que vive esses problemas para poder entendê-los e ajudar a combater. Obrigada. Aquele abraço grande. Amanhã estaremos juntos, Luísa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Annika, do you have any questions you'd like to respond to or remarks to make?
Yes, thanks, Louise. I'll just be very brief. I think following from what Commissioner Manuela had said about police accountability, there's 3 other angles to it that we should just keep in mind. We allow the police to do what they do partly through the legislation which creates petty offences, and particularly when we respond to public health issues, there's a tendency to want to resolve that through criminal measures and creating loads of different crimes dealing with potential risks of transmission, or not wearing a mask, or spreading false news about it, or whatever else. And it has, those sort of provisions have empowered the police. What we need is the executive to be very clear to the police about what they can and can't do, and what they and the need for them to follow adequate codes of conduct. We need Parliament more particularly to actually exercise oversight over the police and the conduct they do during emergencies, but we also need Parliament to review legislation and to monitor its implementation, so that we do not have legislation that actually exceeds proportionality requirements. And then finally, in none of our countries will we be able to take up police abuse if we can't eventually go to the court and have the court actually call out the police and call out the executive for laws which are disproportionate or unconstitutional, and for actions that follow on that. So I think what we also all need to work at is improving judicial independence. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. And your comment, I'm just going to abuse the fact I'm the chair at the moment. It reminds me that the Commission, through the work of former Special Rapporteur, adopted the Luanda guidelines, the guidelines on arrest, police custody and pre-trial detention in Africa. And that I think part 8 or part 7 of those guidelines creates that accountability architecture for criminal justice. So the Commission has turned its mind to it. I mean, we were asked the specific question around policing, but I would commend that document to anybody interested in the sort of the regional perspective on that. So thank you very much, Annika. I'm going to ask Adrian, in 2 or 3 minutes, is there any final words you'd like to make or to respond to any questions that were put to you in the Q&A? Great, thank you very much, Commissioner. Please go ahead, Adrian.
Ok, merci. Encore une fois. Rapidement, le dernier mot, c'est d'abord de remercier la Fondation Osiwa pour son appui à l'ONG Les Mêmes Droits pour tous dans le cadre de l'assistance que nous apportons aux victimes de délits mineurs en Guinée. L'appui nous a permis aussi de réaliser une étude sur la situation des délits mineurs et je vous assure que même ce matin, avant même de venir à cette rencontre, j'étais au niveau du ministère de la Justice en Guinée où j'ai rencontré des autorités pour une rencontre de plaidoyer pour la dépénalisation des délits mineurs en Guinée. L'autre chose, c'est que l'appui qui nous permet d'assister des victimes touche véritablement des personnes qui sont de nature, qui sont pauvres. Comme exemple, c'est un enfant de la rue qui travaille en cirant des chaussures dans une gare routière en plein cœur de Conakry, qui a été accusé du vol d'un téléphone et qui s'est retrouvé en prison. Et c'est grâce à cet appui-là que nous avons de la Fondation Osiwa que nous l'avons trouvé en prison, nous l'avons assisté jusqu'à obtenir sa libération. Aujourd'hui, il est un enfant libre. Un troisième point, c'est que l'appui nous permet aujourd'hui de nous occuper de la réinsertion des détenus victimes, des détenus, des personnes poursuivies pour des délits mineurs qui sortent. Donc, nous sommes en train actuellement, grâce à l'appui de Osiwa, de travailler sur la réinsertion de ces personnes-là. Donc, des apprentis qui ont perdu tout, de petits commerçants qui ont tout perdu pour avoir séjourné des mois durant en prison et qui aujourd'hui sortent et qui sont désemparés, qui ne savent pas où aller. Nous les aidons à regagner leurs parents. Ensuite, nous les aidons à reconstituer leur petit commerce et à s'insérer dans la société. Et ça, c'est un appui inestimable que nous pouvons appuyer. Dernier élément, peut-être si le temps me le permet, une approche, c'est sous forme de question qui a été posée, est-ce que les abus policiers au niveau de la Guinée, de la Sierra Leone, est-ce qu'il y a une comparaison entre ces abus du temps de Ebola et du temps de la COVID? Il n'y a aucune commune mesure. Les abus policiers actuellement du temps de la COVID sont largement au-delà de ce que nous avions connu avec la période pendant la période de Ebola, où il n'y a pas eu assez de l'état d'urgence quasi permanent. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'abus actuellement. Les travailleurs de sexe, je ne vais pas parler d'autres qualités, notamment, qui sont embarqués, des conducteurs de mototaxis qui sont arrêtés, qui sont rançonnés, des femmes du marché qui voient leurs marchandises confisquées, donc leur petit fonds de commerce disparaît. Donc, tous ces abus-là, c'est aujourd'hui, pendant cette période de Covid, que nous constatons ces abus-là. Donc, il y a beaucoup de perspectives d'avenir, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire, comme l'a dit Madame la Commissaire, au niveau de la police, comme l'a dit aussi Anneke, au niveau de la police pour les former, pour les sensibiliser sur les droits des citoyens, surtout les droits de l'homme pendant cette période de Covid-19. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And could I ask, while the other panelists are giving their final remarks, if you've got already published that study, if you could make the link available in the chat box. If you haven't, then that's fine. But if it is available for people to read, it'd be great to share the link. So then I'd ask my colleague Temba, for any final reflections or thoughts or responses to comments or questions in the chat box. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Louise. I did not have questions directed to me, but I just want to reflect on three things. The security forces, particularly the police, the military, have a very important role to play during times of crisis like this. And in what they do, there should be a source of hope, a source of security to its citizens by providing education and awareness. I think this was completely missed in the manner in which the security forces were used during this period. My view is that the police and the military also needed to be trained, at least to be briefed properly in terms of these regulations. In many instances, the militaries and the police were not aware of what they were enforcing. In certain instances, they enforced these regulations as if they were enforcing a state of emergency. We did not have a state of emergency in South Africa. People were attacked in their homes, like the now famous case of Colin Koza, who was killed in his own home while he was enjoying time with his family, but because he was drinking alcohol, which had been prohibited, but it was not prohibited inside the home. So part of what was important that was completely missing in the approach by our government was that they did not properly prepare the police and the military. Talking to our guys in our colleagues in the police union, they raised this issue that our members are not aware of these regulations, and they need, because there was no time to brief them. There was no time to reflect and to properly, for police officers to properly understand exactly what they're enforcing. That's why in many instances, these regulations or this lockdown was enforced as if it was a state of emergency. We did not have a state of emergency. The last point, Louise, is that my view is that there's still a process of healing that is still required in our country. We've seen a lot of abuses by security forces, particularly on the vulnerable and the poor. And it traces back to the period pre-democracy. That process has not been embarked on. The relationship between the communities and our security forces need to be mended through a process of healing. And I think the government need to take more responsibility in making sure that that happens. The TRC, which gave us a huge opportunity, did not dwell, or at least did not delve into this issue of healing, particularly reconciling the militaries and the communities that were severely affected by military operations. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Temba. I mean, South Africa is often held up in discourse on security sector reform on this continent as being to an extent a good practice example of a transformation of police. But I think those comments you've made about that issue of there's not been that process of healing, that we're still seeing these abuses, just demonstrates to us how challenging the task is of police reform, police transformation, and how far we have to go. And it shows, yeah, the failures, it's deeper than law reform. I'd like to pass finally to Lydia. Lydia, we've got a couple of minutes left. If you can just very briefly give your responses, and then I'll give a 30-second conclusion. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Louise. And thank you everyone for attending and participating. My last words would just be that just to have an awareness that this COVID crisis has increasingly escalated from being a public health crisis to a human rights crisis. So we call upon every person engaged in fighting this to ensure that human rights are at the front and ensure that no one is left behind, especially affecting disproportionately the vulnerable and poor in our community. But in relation to the police use of excessive force, we would call states, of course, to set up effective and efficient systems to monitor these measures that are adopted and to take corrective measures and undertake investigations on all cases of allegations of violations of human and people's rights. And of course, as advocate, would still call upon release of all detainees who are vulnerable and do not pose a threat to community to ensure that we lessen the risk of outbreak and spread of COVID, and that the government and specifically police does not disproportionately target the women and girls, further creating petty offenses to manage the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gossar, I don't know if you've got any final remark that you want to make. Otherwise, do you want to just indicate, Gossar?
Louise, you can proceed and conclude on our behalf.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would really love to just thank everybody for attending. Commissioner Manuela needed to leave, but to extend my deep thanks to her for not only just doing the ceremonial necessities that her position and her mandate would require in a conference like this, but for actually engaging in the substantive issues. I really want to thank my panelists, to you all, to Annika, to Adrian, Temba, Lydia, to Gossar for a great scene setting at the very beginning. But particularly thank you to you, the conference participants, for engaging in day two. It wasn't the easiest of topics, looking at that issue of enforcement. It's quite bleak. We've got a long way to go. But I think we ended on a good note. We've ended on a note where we reflected on some of the key challenges, but also the pathways out. And I hope that you'll stay with us tomorrow, because we're going to shift from, so day one, we looked at criminalisation. Day two, we're looking at issues of enforcement. Day three, we're going to look at issues around access to justice. And we're going to have two sessions. We're going to have one on precisely that issue, access to justice, and looking at the role of the judiciary. We're also going to have a session that looks at this issue of socioeconomic rights. So thank you for being part of day two. We'll provide a short conclusion, a short summary at the beginning of tomorrow. And just a final reminder that in the chat box was copied a link to the statement that we're hoping we can have come out of this conference. So just a reminder that it is a Google document. It's there for your comment and engagement. I thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow.